My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. National regulatory bodies have a difficult role to play. They're the enforcement arm of national health and safety standards, and often not the most popular kid at the playground. Businesses, even those that claim to value safety, may accuse them of overreach and interference. Workers may see them as creating rules that are either too restrictive or not protective enough. But I don't think anyone would argue that they are not a critical piece of modern occupational health and safety. Today's guest is a former Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health in the United States. He will, of course, be speaking about his experience in the U.S. at OSHA, but I'm planning a broad discussion with themes that are applicable to occupational safety in any country. So, global listeners, stick around. Doug Parker served as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health during the Biden administration. Before leading OSHA, he was Chief of California's Division of Occupational Safety and Health and previously served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Mine Safety and Health Administration. That's quite a mouthful. Parker was first exposed to workplace safety issues as a labor law attorney representing unions, and later directed a legal aid organization dedicated to worker safety and rights. He's currently a consultant and a fellow at Harvard Law School's Center for Labor and a Just Economy. Doug joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. Good to be here.
So I'd like to start broadly because I suspect one of the most common misconceptions about OSHA and parallel bodies in other countries is that they're only about enforcement. So what kinds of other activities and roles does OSHA play?
Thank you for the question. I think that it is important to understand that OSHA has a broad mandate under its statute. And while certainly enforcement is a critical component of what it's all about, it also has statutory mandates to work with health and human services to advance the science and technology of health and safety. It has an important regulatory function to ensure that regulations are not just there for enforcement, to provide direction for employers on how to meet minimum standards for health and safety. It provides a huge amount of guidance and interpretation to give employers direction on how to comply and how to address particularly issues that don't have specific regulations, so best practices in various areas of health and safety. An important role in consultation and compliance assistance to ensure that employers, particularly smaller businesses that need assistance in health and safety, have those resources available. And I think that one of the biggest gaps in that area is really getting the information out there and making sure that small employers have the trust in OSHA to reach out without fear of there being some enforcement strings attached. OSHA keeps a very strict wall between its enforcement activities and its so-called compliance assistance or consultation activities. And so there is an educational process in making sure that employers are aware of that. And then, of course, there's an important element that kind of has been emphasized or de-emphasized over time, but it's really a critical one, and that's appraising workers of their rights, making sure that workers understand health and safety issues, that they are playing an active role as the OSHA Act intended to be part of a kind of three stools of a chair, right? The government, management, and labor or workers, in ensuring that a workplace has a strong health and safety protections and a strong health and safety culture.
Okay, so you talked about some of the difficulty of letting people know some of these roles, which leads nicely into my next question. National bodies function based on relationships. When OSHA tries to engage in dialogue with organizations or industry associations, what kinds of barriers often come up? You mentioned one already, that sort of fear that enforcement is really strongly linked.
I think that it takes a lot of work and a lot of leadership demonstration to ensure that stakeholders understand that OSHA is not just there to gather evidence or to find fault, but is there to be part of an active dialogue and play a leading role in advancing health and safety that goes beyond compliance. One of the examples that I can think of of how this can go wrong is from early in our term, or perhaps it was, yeah, it was early in our term. It was an effort to gather information from employers about various best practices, and I believe the example was about leading indicators and the use of and also the use of health and safety management systems was a particular program element that we were looking for feedback on. And it was very difficult to get employers to volunteer information about, or to respond to this request for information where we were trying to kind of gather best practices in a kind of a single catalog that would be available for other employers to use. And I think that what it was an example of is people simply not being able to think of OSHA outside of its box of enforcement and its box of government, and people being afraid to provide information to the government that it might somehow be a liability ultimately for them. So that was a lesson that I learned as the leader of OSHA, and really tried very hard to engage with associations, engage with health and safety organizations, particularly employer-oriented associations that had a health and safety element, but were not primarily focused on health and safety. So building associations and so forth, and really emphasizing to them that we are serious about enforcement, but it doesn't mean that we don't also want to play an important role as leaders in health and safety, and that includes recognizing employers when they're making positive steps, but also understanding that these are complex issues, that we're trying to solve in the health and safety world. That there aren't silver bullets, and we can't have simplistic rewards for employers that are just kind of performative. It's a much more iterative process, and that requires OSHA to be, a partner and a member of the conversation when it comes to how to advance health and safety outside of just enforcement. And I think we made progress, but it's an ongoing process for government.
Yeah, I can imagine, just as you said, there's no silver bullets for health and safety management systems. I imagine there's no silver bullets for building these relationships. But I'm a little bit curious, in what way, or maybe how much, does OSHA interact with each of these following groups? So, like industry associations, company executives, unions, and individual workers. Like, where is the focus in terms of developing relationships?
Well, it's somewhat tiered depending on the element, or the part of OSHA that you're talking about. So in the headquarters, at the headquarters level, like a lot of things that happen in Washington, it tends to be very association oriented, and also talking to unions at the kind of international level, or national headquarters level. So and the advantage is that there's a lot of power in the room, a lot of authority in the room when you have those conversations with association leaders and union leaders. But there's also a lot of filters, right? Like and I'm talking about the kind of vertical filters. So information that's coming up from the shop floor level, if you will. It's going through a lot of filters as it comes up, both from the OSHA perspective, what we hear from our people as it comes up through management, what the folks in the unions are hearing, and also what the associations are hearing. And it can be a game of telephone in terms of sometimes acting on a set of assumptions that are generally accurate, but maybe don't always tell the whole picture, and because you haven't done the digging yet. But I would say that that's the case at the national level, and it's very important from or was very important from my perspective to make sure that you don't just take those conversations at face value, that you're trying to do the digging to kind of measure them against other sounding boards. So and that means trying to get out of the field and talking to individuals. So the other extreme is at the inspector level. The compliance officer may never meet someone from an association unless they're asked to go give a talk at a local chapter. But they talk to individual employers and individual workers regularly during inspection activity or consultation activity, if their role is consultation. So, and then at the regional level, you kind of have a mix, right? So, but the upshot of all that is that you have to be able to recognize that information is imperfect and have processes in place to ensure that you are constantly getting feedback to make sure that what you're hearing is consistent with what's happening on the ground. So doing listening sessions, going out into the field, talking to worker centers. So not just unions, but people who are representing non-unionized workers, who often have local community groups that support them and serve as a forum for them to speak to leaders. And on the employer side, understanding that talking to individual employers and executives is critically important, because a lot of times at the association level, the health and safety issues are filtered through other prisms, right? So, and they can get more politicized than they have to be. Or what happens most often is that they fall into kind of tired old kind of formulas for what our various roles are, right? So, if you're trying to break out of a role of same old government, say, just enforcement, or they don't listen to us, or or they're only out to serve some other purpose, you have to find ways to break through that, and talking directly to employers and listening to them is a great way to do that.
So you may have partially just answered my next question, but when you were there, how did OSHA invite conversation? So I think you just gave us some examples. Are there Were there activities that worked particularly well or particularly poorly to kind of cultivate that good communication with industries or organizations?
Yes. One of the things that we were particularly proud of doing was having the first workers forum in the Department of Labor on health and safety. And it's not unusual over the years for there to be significant summits uh, uh, you know, of different groups of stakeholders at the Department of Labor, but there'd never been one that really focused on bringing individual rank and file workers to the Labor Department to talk about the issues that they face on the job. And it wasn't just about having a listening session with me and other, senior leadership at OSHA, although that was certainly an important part of the event, but also bringing our regional and district leadership, or some of our regional and district leadership also there to listen to the concerns of workers. And workers came from all over the country, from all walks of life, from all professions, to talk about the issues that they have on the job. And while union there was some union representation there, these were mainly rank and file workers who may or may not have been represented by unions. So, and it ran from, it was amazing, from nurses to people who cleaned airplanes, to laundry workers, to machinists, to even there were even strippers there, who were there talking about some of the issues that they faced in their workplaces. So it was about as diverse a group of folks from workplace that you could imagine. And it was very powerful to give them platform to talk to national leadership about their issues, and for folks to hear in a in a kind of a long format, if that's a word, to sort of understand their broader concerns about the workplace.
Yeah,
In
it's different looking someone in the eye and listening to their story than it is to read bullet points that have kind of worked their way through the filters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then in terms of things that failed, I don't know that it was a failure, but I know that we were very interested in how to develop programs that would incentivize health and safety management systems, and we framed it as a new look at our voluntary compliance, or voluntary protection program that we work. But the main focus was how to incentivize health and safety management systems, and what OSHA could do to to promote them. And it was a successful set of conversations, but there was, to go back to a theme, a real difference in the conversations that we had at the national level, and the conversations that happened out at the regional level in smaller groups. And it is that, and it may be some of that psychology of, of speaking to an audience, right? But it tended to be it tended to be a more careful conversation, a more scripted conversation, a conversation that was more, you contained, than the dialogue that was had in some of the conversations that we had in the field. So again, just a lesson about the importance of finding ways, if you're the government, to break down barriers to honest conversation, and really show people that you're listening, and give them a forum where they can speak without feeling like they're going to be, in the paper if they say something that people might take umbrage with.
I imagine reconciling all the different points of view was an internal subject of discussion quite a bit. But I'm curious, you mentioned listening sessions. How can you explain, like, walk me through how that typically worked, or, the goals?
I have to give a lot of credit to both the Office of Standards and Guidance and the Office of Cooperative and State Programs, who led this effort. It was a very curated process in which a set of questions were laid out for people to answer. They were given information ahead of time. It was all done. Of course, it's the government, so you have to give notice of these meetings, and they're public, and it's not like rulemaking, but you do have to follow certain processes to ensure transparency, and of course we embrace that because that's what we were looking for. So we laid out the issues that we wanted to embrace health and safety management. We wanted to look at health and safety culture and promoting that within workplaces at all levels. That we were looking for ways to take the model of voluntary protection, and or not necessarily that model, but as an example, how can we expand this to include employers that are still very much on their safety journey? And just by way of background, the voluntary protection program in the United States is one that rewards very high performing health and safety programs at employers, work sites specifically, with recognition. They're sort of removed from the possibility of certain types of programmed inspections by OSHA. So they can still be inspected if there's a complaint, if there's an injury, but they are not subject to random surprise inspections as a result of being in this program. And so it's of course, as a result of that, it's a very labor intensive process for OSHA, which makes it very difficult to scale. So we were looking at, what would be alternative approaches that would incentivize employers to put these systems in place. So we were looking for information about the business case, right? Why it makes sense from an operational perspective, just trying to understand from a behavioral approach, if you will, how to bring more employers into the fold, and also not do so in a way that really requires them to get to the mountaintop, if so to speak, in order to be part of a program that kind of meet them where they are. So those are the types of questions that we put out. Many were broader than that because we weren't wedded to a particular approach. We wanted to really open it up to all ideas. But that's how we did it, and we reached out to folks through open meetings. We also had some kind of focus group meetings to delve into particular aspects of safety culture, promoting safety culture, and looking at things like worker participation and other things with kind of smaller groups as well. So it was a pretty comprehensive approach.
Okay, so we've just spent a whole bunch of time talking about how OSHA is much more than enforcement, but I do have an enforcement question because, as you said earlier, you want people to know about all these other programs and all these other roles that it can play. However, you do take enforcement seriously. So I think it's a tricky balance. I think enforcement in general, like too much and everyone lies or hides to avoid punishment, too little and then people aren't protected. How do you see that? Like this is more of a blue sky theoretical question. Like where do you think ideally an enforcement body should kind of aim on that spectrum?
In order to have the balance, you have to have a certain level of abundance, right? And right, there has to be a minimum amount of capacity for both enforcement and other activities in order to even start talking about what the balance ought to be. That's ideal. And so it for someone who's in the leadership of an organization like OSHA, it really has it's a somewhat different analysis, which is what are the gaps that only government can do? And so there are lots of resources out there that provide employers with guidance. They can hire people, they can look to free resources, they can look to OSHA, but only OSHA can do enforcement. Or there is no there is no posse out there that's going to ride in and conduct private enforcement. So that's the prism through which you have to look at it. And that's not to say that, of course, that OSHA should just be enforcement because they're the only ones who can do it. But it does affect the question when people complain about the role of OSHA. There's only one part of that formula where OSHA has exclusive authority, and that is to conduct enforcement. And sadly, there are plenty of while the majority of employers are certainly trying to do the right thing, there are plenty of folks who aren't listening to this and similar podcasts or are going out to these and other resources who are not acting responsibly and are an appropriate candidates for enforcement activity to protect workers. So having said all that, I think that it's still really important for OSHA to be more than just an enforcement body because the other side of it is that they have a tremendous platform, right? It's a huge opportunity to reach employers that no other. I mean, that's the other thing that is exclusive to a government agency is the reach of its message that a professional association, just can't replicate. And so so maybe rather than striking a balance, I would say think that agencies need to think about this role in terms of where are the gaps that only they can fill. And certainly enforcement is one of them. I think reaching out to small businesses and businesses without a lot of resources and helping them is another one because that's an area where it just isn't going to happen if it involves hiring a safety consultant. That we're talking about really, assistance in developing baseline tools and that aren't behind a paywall, and that somebody's got to do that. And I think that's often going to be government, and even going out and doing on-site consultations, which I used to go out, just kind of ride along with those occasionally when I was in California and loved doing that, and meeting people. But also, it's that pulpit, and it's not necessarily it's sometimes the bully pulpit, and sometimes it's just a tremendous opportunity to speak up about improving culture and providing a much more positive message, so to speak, about advancing health and safety and health and safety management systems. Because if an agency isn't showing leadership in the field, then people who are leaders in the field are going to start to really think of it as less and less relevant. And I think that's ultimately harmful for a government agency, even if even if their mission and what leaders in the field are trying to do on a more advanced level are misaligned because the enforcement agency is more focused on a floor, and the professionals are more focused on how to get to the next level. I mean, that's a reality, but it's not. It's a gap that I think we don't want to get too wide, because it then affects the relevance of the agency within the field, and that's bad.
Yeah, I was just thinking I hadn't thought about relevance, but it's a huge it would be a huge issue. It would or should be a huge focus for any kind of government entity working on this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people need to understand the field, and it's a real challenge when you're talking about development of employees. And I mean, you hire professionals, and they don't want to just, they want to do enforcement. They're passionate about it, but they also want to stay up to date in their field, and that yields a lot of benefits. And it's a challenge in government.
You have an interesting background. You didn't start in safety. You were an attorney that represented labor unions. Based on that experience and now your experience in OSHA, what do you think employers often get wrong about workers' motivations?
That's an interesting question. I will say that the most important thing that employers get wrong is that they think employees care about their motivations. So they put too much emphasis on their intention, especially when it comes to areas of fear of retaliation, speaking up on the job about safety issues. An employer may often say, for example, that people aren't going to be retaliated against, that workers should speak up about hazards on the job. People should not be afraid of punishment if they want to raise a safety concern, or blow a whistle. But it's not enough to just say that occasionally, because workers don't care about your intentions. The calculus of risk that is in a worker's mind, or many workers' minds, when they are thinking about speaking up in the workplace, is I could I could lose my job if I don't get this right. And this might come to a shock to many employers who want to do the right thing and don't even think, it doesn't even cross their mind that they would want to punish or retaliate or fire a worker for something. But you have to remember that the worker has a totally different risk calculation in making a decision about whether to speak up. And so it's very important, though, that's not just rhetoric, that employers demonstrate it, and that they make it clear that speaking up is an expectation rather than just a right. Because a right is something that someone is free to exercise and decide whether or not to exercise. And it's important, and it's important for legal reasons to think of it that way. But in the workplace, from a safety perspective, it's much more important to think of it as an expectation, that people speak up, and that there are positive rewards, and that you're creating a culture where people don't think twice about whether or not you ought to speak up, because it's embedded, rather than a more individualistic decision. You want to take that risk calculus kind of out of the decision about speaking up. And I think that's something that employers often get wrong about workers. They don't fully appreciate, what's on the line for a worker about speaking up, or they view the worker's risk calculus through the prism of their own intentions, when nobody cares about your intentions. They care about making sure they can put food on the table, and um, that they aren't risking you know, the scorn of their employer, or risking, being alienated from their own coworkers sometimes about speaking up about something.
It sounds like they need to be aware of the power differential in there and how their actions, like saying one thing and doing another, can have an outsized effect when someone else is in a position that's somewhat more vulnerable, where they may and also workers come to a job with past experiences. So you may be a great employer, but that doesn't mean that every worker knows that immediately. Like they have to see it in action.
That's right. You have to demonstrate it regularly, uh, and and you have to emphasize it again and again and again because and I think that employers, while it's a business, people in management would think of it, can often think of this in very personal terms, right? That they're a good person, so they don't have to worry about emphasizing this, and people ought to see that. But you can't. You have to take your own kind of self, out of you have to take that kind of self out of the equation and think about it from another person's perspective in order to really fully appreciate the need to be proactive in your leadership on health and safety.
Yeah, people cannot mind read your intentions. They can only see how you act. When we last spoke, you said that if organizations focus on their health and safety systems, compliance kind of takes care of itself. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. And what I am, and I'm not suggesting that people are going to automatically absorb the rules and regulations that they need to follow about how high up you have to have fall protection, or there are specific rules that you need to follow. But in terms of the thing that employers often express concern about when they complain about enforcement as the model, as opposed to a more proactive and dynamic systems approach to health and safety. They complain that they are about a fear of adopting health and safety management systems or other approaches that are more holistic, that it will be at the expense of compliance, and that it will result in fines because they're not focused on the letter of the law. And my response has been, well, you can do both, but if you're really concerned about the penalty amounts, and the penalty amounts really mainly come into play when you're talking about things going seriously wrong. If you're really worried about those kinds of liabilities rather than more de minimis penalties, if you have a strong health and safety management system, then you are going to be resolving hazards in a way that's going to keep you out of serious trouble with the agency. And you're going to be demonstrating good faith. You're going to be demonstrating a proactive approach. And in my view, while you might be upset that you sometimes get dinged for a a more pedestrian kind of violation, a record keeping violation or something, you're by focusing on the big picture, you are, and really focus on a culture of health and safety, you are going to have benefits that are going to far outweigh any small financial penalty you might have by not focusing on, more or less, I'll say less serious penalties or violations.
If regulatory bodies are in the business of changing behavior within organizations, and feel free to question that assumption, but if they're in the business of changing behavior, what kind of leverage do they realistically have to do that?
Well, I do think that the most powerful tool is the power of the pulpit that government has, and that an agency that is focused on doing the right thing, treating people fairly, committed to strong enforcement, committed to helping people who are proactive in reaching out for help, and is listening to stakeholders and taking their concerns very seriously in the rulemaking process, and making that as much of a dialogue as they can when doing rulemaking, as opposed to just decreeing things. That's an agency that has set itself up well to be able to speak with authority and with trust to its stakeholders. And there are a lot of people that would say they didn't agree with my approach, or didn't agree with my views on labor issues, for example, but they knew where I was coming from, and they knew that they could sit down and talk with me, and that I would listen to them. And that's as important a compliment to me as is to hear from people who like me because we were like-minded, right? It's critical that you have to take that approach when you are in government, and if you want to be successful, you have to be able to listen to people and be willing to have your views challenged. And if an agency takes that approach and can build trust, then they can really make a difference in getting people to develop the health and safety culture that we'd like them to see. At the end of my term, even though there were things that the Voluntary Protection Association and I had differing views on, I think we had a lot of respect for each other, and they were they ultimately changed their kind of mission statement based on the work that we did and the work that we did with them, to not only be focused on the members of their association, but to make that more outreach oriented, and as I used to say, more evangelical, right? They're really trying to convert others to the cause of health and safety programs and health and safety management systems. And I think that was the result of our work to develop trust through listening and dialogue.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, sure, behavior change can happen or be a goal or an aim, but without the foundation of trust and respect, it's not going to go anywhere.
I think that's right. And another example is from our rulemaking on heat. I mean, yes, developing a rule is the vehicle through which we're having these conversations, but we had a huge number of sort of pre-rulemaking dialogues. We've had lots of discussions with associations, and we went from 10 years ago in the United States of there being really no, maybe 10, 15 years ago, being no serious interest in regulating heat to more or less a consensus on the fact that there is need for some kind of a standard for protecting workers from heat illness. And while there may be differences of opinion on how to approach it, that consensus changed because of a lot of dedicated people at the grassroots level who were um, were out there talking about it. And really, our role was that we listened to them, and by listening to them, we were able to channel that kind of grassroots concern into a movement within government that then gave a real amplification.
I'm going to ask sort of two opposing questions here. So the first one is, what is your magic wand, blue sky, no limits wish for regulatory bodies like OSHA? Do you feel like in general they need more or less of something? Do they need to adjust their focus? Like if resources and access were not barriers and I suppose you had a genie on your side, what would you change?
So I think if I had a genie, well, I would probably start with I have a frustration with enforcement that is different than what a lot of people in the field have with enforcement, but I think it's kind of a cousin to kind of a cousin to their concerns, which is that our the greatest frustration is with the lower road, if you will, employers who just do the things wrong again and again, get fines over and over and over again, don't pay them, and then someone dies, and then another person dies, and then we may bring criminal charges ultimately, or maybe they disappear and reemerge as a new company. And so and the ask is always, well, why didn't OSHA do more? So I think that I would, if I had a magic wand, it would be to give in the United States far more authority to stop employers who are engaged in that kind of egregious behavior. I think you just wouldn't believe sometimes the kinds of things that some employers will do, to putting their workers at risk. I mean, you might, but others outside of the field would be shocked. And so, and I'll go even further. While that would be my magic wand wish, I would even trade some of the enforcement issues that employers find so annoying. If there's some kind of trade off you could do, I would do that in order to really bring the power of government to bear to stop employers who get it wrong again and again and again and put workers at risk to get them out of business would be I'd be willing to make other trade-offs in that in this imaginary genie world where bargain make these kinds of bargains that you described. So that would be one thing. The other would be to speed rulemaking, because it just takes it's such a long process, and it's frustrating for everybody. At least in the United States, it's a very long process that has been further burdened by congressional requirements, by the Office of Management and Budget requirements, by the product of litigation, challenging rules over the years. And it's created a very burdensome process that, we did some things to make it faster, I think. But ultimately, it's not good for anyone. I know that there are some employer groups out there that are glad it takes too long because they don't want to see more regulation. But it also impedes the ability to adjust regulations to keep up with the times. So when people complain about regulations getting outdated, guess what? We have OSHA has a long list of outdated regulations because there's an ecosystem that has been created through through an adversarial process in courts that has given us this burdensome process. And it is not. I don't think it's what Congress intended when they talked about the ability to make rules. And I understand the risk of overreach, and that's certainly got to be a concern of an agency. But I think the current formula is one in which everybody starts to lose faith in government, and that's just not good.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask sort of the opposite, away from blue sky thinking. Practically speaking, what do you wish safety professionals, because that's our audience, what do you wish they knew that would make them more effective at engaging with OSHA and maybe getting the full potential benefit of that relationship?
Interesting question. So I think that I don't know, but I'll give you. I'll kind of try to hone in on it, and it would have something to do with how they triangulate between OSHA and their executive management, right? The leadership of their organization, right? So, and I mean, maybe this is something to kind of cogitate on, but how could OSHA be a tool in getting to improving their communications with senior leadership of their organizations? Because I don't think the problem is engaging with safety professionals necessarily. I think it is about the challenge both OSHA and safety professionals have, which is how do you, how, at least in some, and I mean, we're generalizing here, but, how do you implement lasting change, right? Because, and how could OSHA activity be a leverage or opportunity for that safety professional to have more pull within their own organization to create change, right? So an OSHA, and I think this gets back to this incentive program that I was talking about earlier. How could OSHA activity create opportunities to really land, rather than a fine and abatement of a particular hazard, to result in a more lasting change that is more comprehensive within the workplace, abatement as a health and safety management system in place, for example. So I don't know that I have a specific answer for you, but with a little more thought, it would land somewhere in that area of how to help that safety professional create change. And I think it might require OSHA to come a little way, to make a little more movement in that direction first. But that would be the if I could sort of cheat and borrow half my magic wand from the first question and combine it with this one, it would be, how to bridge that gap where we could help that safety professional create more change within the organization.
So you were with OSHA for just over 3 years. What maybe surprised you or challenged your assumptions? when you did nothing very specific, but just like maybe things about OSHA or regulation in general that you maybe weren't expecting?
OSHA is many more subparts than other organizations that I've been a part of. So I was kind of always learning new acronyms of offices that I didn't know we had, working on, important issues, but maybe ones that I hadn't come across before. But I would say the biggest surprise had to do with the organization of the agency as a whole, that it has an organizational structure that you really have to hard in to avoid siloing of roles, because it has, this whole regional structure that in some ways duplicates, and in some ways is distinct from the national headquarters, which has a series of offices. And so you see how there's opportunities for both inconsistency, there's opportunities for for communication that isn't ideal, and there's opportunities for it to all work really well, but it's not every other organization that I worked in. The structure seemed a little more linear in its, in how things sort of went up and down the chain of command. And at OSHA, it was different in that you had 10 regions that are doing a lot of things similar to efforts at the national headquarters. So there was certainly a learning curve in thinking about how to get everyone to work together. Not that they weren't doing it, but that, when you had a particular initiative that was new to the agency, how you made sure that how all the right pieces were plugged in. It was a bigger task than I was expecting.
Sure, like facilitating a different type of structure or facilitating
Yeah, yeah.
communication. Yeah,
I mean, and by the end of my time, I was just having all hands meetings, which ultimately that was I kind of started practicing more of what I preached, which I'd done earlier, which is to do more general leadership than management tinkering about these things. And that seemed to get the message to everyone.
okay, so you may have just answered this question, but maybe not. If you could go back to the beginning of what you consider your safety career, whatever point in time that was, what's one piece of advice that you might give yourself?
A piece of advice that I would give myself would be and I think this is more general and not necessarily specific to health and safety, but because I was not a traditionally trained health and safety professional, because I came at this more obliquely as an attorney, I was have at times been kind of deferential to so-called experts about how to handle things, and there's a few times where I wish I could go back and just tell myself to trust my instincts and be assertive about what I thought was right, and be more challenging on understanding their perspective on things. But that's really just a handful of times. I think most of the time felt pretty good about how I kind of balance humility of not understanding some of the technical aspects initially, and versus really challenging folks to think from a different perspective. So, a worker perspective, or um, a legal perspective, enforcement perspective, and sort of. So I think it generally worked out. But I think there are a few examples I can think of that where I wish I'd been more assertive.
I think there's probably a few examples everyone could think of. That's true. But it's hindsight, right? We often don't know that until later. How can our listeners learn more about any of the topics in our discussion today? Like, are there particular, probably websites more than books, where they can learn more either about OSHA or really about any of the questions we've asked and answered?
Well, sure. So there are a lot of resources on the OSHA webpage, osha.gov, that can give you information on OSHA, its organization, its structure. It's somewhat daunting. You can really go down a lot of rabbit holes on that webpage. On that website, there's a huge amount of information. Areas that I think, might be particularly useful. There are pages on health and safety management systems under the under the Director of Standards and Guidance, and they have some good resources on mental health, for example, that we put together while I was there. There's a lot of information on training modules that have been created over time. I also think that there's some really good resources on some of the state OSHA pages. So if you go to, Cal OSHA has an excellent website with a lot of resources as well as some of the other agencies out there. And interesting because California does have a injury and illness prevention plan standard, which requires employers to have a program. They have some good tools there on just the basics of how to, templates and basics for how to develop a health and safety management program. And some of it's California centric, but it can be pretty useful for anyone who's going through the process of hazard analysis and developing something in writing.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be useful even beyond national boundaries. It's free information.
Absolutely. I internationally, I think if you're focused on workers, there's an organization called Hesperian that has some very good publications on workers' rights and sort of general worker safety information and how to sort of explain it. And it's in a more global perspective. Good people there that I've worked with when I was in California, and they some of their materials translated into other languages as well.
So where can our listeners find you on the web?
Well, the best place is probably through LinkedIn. I get a fair number of messages from people there, and I'm pretty easy to find. If anybody wants to reach out to me directly, my email's pretty simple. It's dougparker1@gmail.com, and anyone's welcome to reach out if they have further questions about anything we talked about.
Well, folks, the regulatory body of time is telling me that the show has come to a close. Thanks so much for sharing your perspective, Doug. I don't think that we've ever had someone from inside a regulatory body, so it's really valuable.
Well, happy to do it, and I want to thank you for the opportunity. I've been binge listening to the podcast since we first talked, and really some really valuable information. And I've certainly been learning some things too from some of your past guests. So thank you.
And thank you, listeners. If you've got ideas to share about your vision for safety oversight, please find us on LinkedIn under Safety Labs by Safety Products Global. Thanks to the podcast team. I am just the tip of the iceberg, folks. There's a lot of people, work and good people behind the scenes that make this show the success that it is. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.